Good afternoon and welcome everyone to NFF's 14-part Financial Management webinar series. We're so happy that you've joined us for today's session on Program Economics, which is the first webinar in this series that is tools to support your program and enterprise. I'm Rashi and I'll be facilitating today's webinar session, which is actually being presented by Alice Antonelli. Alice is a director in our advisory services practice, and we both are joining you from NFF's Philadelphia office. Before we get started, I'd just like to share a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so everyone is muted to ensure high sound quality. Even though everyone is on mute, we would still love to hear your questions. You can send your questions at any time by typing them into the chat box that is located near the bottom of your GoToWebinar panel. I'll respond to you via chat right away, and then I'll relay your questions to Alice during our question and answer sections. Within 24 hours following the conclusion of the webinar, you will receive a link to the recorded session, the PowerPoint slides, and other materials to help you apply the concepts we'll review today. It will come from an nff.org email, so be sure to check your spam if it doesn't arrive. If you would like to access the presentation slides now, you can do so by downloading them from the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. You may have to click on the small box with an arrow to expand the handout section to access the slides. That's all from me, so I'm going to hand it over to Alice now to begin the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rashi. And I want to make sure that you can hear me, Rashi, and also we have Kim on the line to help with troubleshooting, because Rashi, your connection was kind of in and out. So just want to do a real quick sound check. How do I sound?
Yeah, you sound good to me. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. Just want to make sure. So, hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Before I begin, just a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund. We are a nonprofit organization with offices around the country. We've been around for 37 years providing loans and investments to nonprofit organizations, providing advice on strategic financial management, and then lifting up what we're learning on the ground to share with others in and across the sector through advocacy. So in this webinar series, we bring not only our work from across the entire sector, but also our history working with nonprofits of all kinds in many different ways. This slide is an overview of our webinar series. We developed this series to help you own your numbers and tell your financial story and make data-informed decisions. Part 1 focused on core financial literacy. Part 2 focused on day-to-day tools for financial communication and reporting. And Part 3 will build on content from Series 1 and 2. This third series will cover such topics as program economics, cost analysis, financial risks and opportunities, scenario planning, growth projections, and collaboration, all tools that support strategic decision-making around overall organizational and program strategies. So today, we're going to begin the conversation about program economics. The economics of every program impact your organization's bottom line. A clear understanding of each program's profitability is critical to making informed decisions. Our program economics model helps nonprofit managers understand how each program contributes to money and to mission. The case study that we will go through will also help you learn how to use program economics tool toward better financial health and maximum mission impact. As review, here are a few goals for today. In this session, we will review a couple of different program economic methodologies to consider. We will develop a program economic tool to help leadership make data-informed decisions. We will look at a framework that helps prioritize mission alignment of different programs. And you will take home a user-friendly program economics model for you to use on your own. As review, here are a few methods to organize financial numbers. the annual budget, which is an overall agency-level financial plan, cash flow projections, which estimate cash flow needs during the fiscal year, accounting, which counts what happened over a specific time period, and most of us are audited by certified public accountants, reports to funders, which confirms expenses and outcomes to grant makers. Over the next 2 weeks, we will discuss one more way, and that's program economics. Economic analysis refers to any analysis that seeks to better understand an organization's revenue and cost structure. When we use an allocated methodology, we look at the cost of a program or service fully loaded, with an allocation of all staff costs and other resources that are necessary for delivery. When we use a direct methodology, we examine the revenue and costs that are only directly tied to a program or service and assess the marginal impact of the program, service, or revenue stream on the organization's bottom line. Because revenue and expense can be organized in many different ways, an economic analysis should be driven by a specific question to shape the approach and methodology. So let's start by looking at the allocated method in the left-hand column. This methodology answers the question, what is the price of my program? What are the fully loaded costs so that I can better price my services, whether to a funder or to develop the fee for the service? Other questions might be the following. Is the organization recouping the total cost of this program, including the allocated overhead, through its grants and contracts? What are the indirect costs for each program? What should be charged to each program to cover indirect costs, or the reverse, how much revenue should be allocated to cover the total indirect costs? The analysis is guided by the question, what portion of staff time and expenses are used to deliver this program? In this instance, we would use the allocation model or tool to help us with the analysis. We're going to go into this allocated tool in more detail in the next webinar. So now let's look on the far right. This methodology is the direct methodology, and it seeks to answer the following questions. What would be the economic result of certain management decisions? For instance, say you wanted to increase your surplus or eliminate a deficit. How can we use the economic analysis to assess the effect of different programmatic decisions on your bottom line? What is each program's contribution to the bottom line? And if this program were scaled, reduced, or discontinued, what would be the impact on the organization's overall surplus or deficit? The analysis is guided by the following questions. If this program were to be discontinued, what revenue and expenses would go away? Would there be any savings? Or how about the reverse? If the program were to grow or to be scaled, what additional revenue and expenses are needed specifically for that program? The tool that we use for this is called the program economics model. We will be exploring this methodology in more detail today. So let's dive into this direct methodology. First, we typically start with an annual budget, forecast, or another forward-looking projection. Then we identify and define all revenue and expenses that are directly tied to each program. All supporting expenses like management, occupancy, fundraising, technology are examined separately. By doing this type of analysis, we can see which programs generate surplus and deficits, thereby understanding the direct effect the program has on the organization's bottom line. This analysis can be done with program managers, finance staff, and organizational leadership. And we believe it provides a clear picture that people without financial expertise can understand and act on. At its core, the program economic direct methodology is an internal strategic tool meant to assist leadership and board in making data-driven decisions. This methodology lets you assess the revenue and expense dynamics of each major program to determine which programs are operating at a profit or a loss, and then allows you to evaluate each program's alignment or misalignment with mission. We can apply this information to decisions about whether and how to cut costs, where subsidy revenue might be needed to support programs or operations, which programs to sustain or grow, and help to identify opportunities to respond to change. This information can inform how you prioritize programs, but also narrow in on activities that deserve more of management's attention on both the revenue and the cost side. I want to emphasize this last point on the slide. Many, if not all, nonprofits make decisions to maintain deficit-producing programs. However, rarely are our costs covered. The key of this analysis is to identify and understand the size of the subsidy needed to cover deficits rather than getting rid of programs hastily. So the first part of the analysis involves a framework like the one that you see on the screen. We call this the Mission Money Matrix, and we use it to understand how each of an organization's programs contribute to mission and also contribute to the organization's bottom line. In the framework, we have mission along the bottom and money along the vertical axis. Let's walk through this. So in the upper right-hand corner are the clear winners. They are aligned with mission and generate a net surplus. That means that the revenue that the program generates exceeds direct expenses. Some questions that we might ask in this quadrant would be, what can we cultivate and preserve these programs? Are there opportunities for growth or replication of programs? Let me tell you that this is a little rare. We are nonprofits for a reason, and most of our mission-related programs cannot generate sufficient funds to cover direct expenses. So let's move to the next quadrant down here. The lower right quadrant represents programs that are closely linked to mission, but that need to be sustained by other areas of the organization. This is far more typical. Questions here might be, is there potential to cut cost? Can the revenue model be changed or tweaked? Does subsidy exist elsewhere in the organization to support these mission-focused programs? All right. The upper left quadrant shows programs that have high contribution but low mission. Let's say that you run a school for the blind and you also have a thrift store that generates net surplus. The thrift store is not really related to mission, but does provide a surplus that the organization can use to subsidize other programs. A question here might be, is there an opportunity to align more with the core mission? So for example, can you incorporate a workforce development aspect into the thrift store business? The last square or quadrant on our grid shows low contribution, low mission. This is an area that might require much soul searching. Most organizations do not choose to operate a program that does not relate to mission. Some, though, experience mission creep, where you run a couple of programs that relate somehow to the mission for a few years, and then those programs may spawn others that relate a lot less. So we need to look at our programs closely to determine which are critical to mission and which act more like addendums or good ideas at the time. Questions in this quadrant might be, what is the current relevance to the organization of this particular program? Is this a legacy program or a one-time program? Are there opportunities for strategic alignment? This simple 2x2 grid can enable a discussion about the relative trade-offs between financial contribution and mission alignment. It's helpful to think about how the role of each of our program plays in the larger context. Some programs will be valuable because of their high mission alignment, and other programs may be critical because of their high net contribution in terms of dollars to the organization. Now, before we go into the case study to really tease out what we've just talked about, I'd like to go to Rashi to see if we have any questions before we move on.
Hi, Alice. Yeah, there was a question that came in, I think, when you were on the program economics model slide, and it said that it is for internal planning purposes only. The question is, why are you saying that?
So that's a great question. And I guess the way that I would answer it is that a lot of times when we think about program economics, I think a lot of us kind of default to an allocated methodology. And so what we're doing here is we're not allocating. And you'll see when we go into the case study that we do, we're going to have program direct costs on one side, and we're going to have overhead and capacity on the other with no allocation. And so if we were to distribute this model or analysis to outside stakeholders without a proper explanation, a lot of people would be a little nervous, freaked out, whatever you want to call it, about the high overhead number because it hasn't been allocated yet. Having said that, I will say I worked with a client one time, and they very much wanted to share this with their stakeholders, particularly one funder in particular. And what we did was make sure we did a full presentation, that the funder understood the methodology behind this, and we walked through just everything, and it was like just detailed. So there was a lot of context setting, if you will. But that's why we say it's for internal purposes, only because that overhead number can shock a lot of people.
That's good. That's all. Thank you.
Great, and thank you all for asking the question. As a reminder, you can type in the questions to the right on your screen in the chat box. So looking forward to getting more questions. All right, so let's head into our case study. Here we go. We're going to use the budget of our fictitious Help for Homeless Youth Agency, otherwise known as HHY, to help illustrate the concept of this program economics direct methodology and also the model that goes along with it. So we introduced Jordan Johnson, the executive director of HHY, a few webinars back, and we're going to use her and also her organization to kind of walk through the concept and the tool. All right. So when we first started working with HHY, we asked these three key questions. First, what questions are you trying to answer? Is the data available to answer the question? And what will this analysis be useful? So the answer to the first question was that Jordan had received a bit of bad news, and HHY was now projecting a deficit by year end. She wanted to address this issue. So to understand the dynamics of what was impacting their profitability or the lack thereof, we suggested that she conduct a program economics modeling exercise, specifically the direct methodology, to get a window into some of the economics of her program. So the answer to question number two, she believed that she did have data for most of her programs. And finally, the last answer, she did believe that this analysis would be useful. Next, we discussed how to build out the program architecture. We'll want to separate out, as I just actually answered on that question just prior, we're going to want to set out the economics of the programs from administration, development, fundraising, facility, technology, and human capital. So the first question is, what do we want to look at, and how detailed do we want to get? We asked Jordan and her team to identify the programs and possible sub-programs that they would like to examine. A quick look at our website, and we found the following statement. HHY is dedicated to providing food, clothing, mentorship, and job opportunities to young people in Philadelphia. But in conversation with Jordan, it seemed like there were a few more programs than just those listed on our website. So I asked her, what would you say are your top 3 to 4 core programs or lines of businesses? And can you group all of the other programs into those 4 core categories? Now, for your organization, it may be more or less, but for Jordan, it was about 3 to 4. Then I asked, are there any programs that you want to take a deeper dive on or analyze in detail? Are there any legacy programs that you want to explore further? Are there any programs that are high performers, or are there laggards? And which ones do you want to look at? So this was the team's first cut into splitting out the core program areas. First is on-site services. This is HHY's oldest program. The organization began as an on-site provider of food and clothing, and then grew into a space where students could get recreational activities as well. Next is the mentorship program. Mentorship has been a big area of growth for HHY as it has garnered a lot of support from the local school system. Job counseling and readiness started out only 5 years ago, but now has become HHY's largest program. And lastly, partner services is a program where HHY partners with other service providers to provide access to quality health and dental care. Notice on the capacity or the non-program side, otherwise known as overhead, Jordan thought it would be a good idea to separate development activities from administration to examine that as well. Next, I asked if there were any sub-programs that they would be interested in examining. So here's what the team came up with. It took a little longer than expected. There were a few programs where they were less than clear on where they should go. For instance, they host an annual Teen Poetry Slam. The Teen Poetry Slam is an outgrowth of the mentorship program and has been wildly successful in attracting a few corporate sponsors. The team was unsure of where to put it, but they finally decided on development as it seemed to the group that it was more of an event and less of a program. So before the spreadsheet and numbers, I want the team to give us their understanding of the impact of each of the programs. Work on profits and their business models. We use the program economic direct methodology to understand the money part. But to understand how programs relate to the mission, we use this tool to learn about mission, impact, or alignment. Note that we're not talking about impact as it relates to program outcomes. We're using that term more broadly. Notice the form or spreadsheet at the bottom of the slide. This is given to each staff and board member, and they will rank the programs on each of the questions asked. On the slide at the top, we have some sample questions that we use to gather this information. So first, alignment with core mission. Rate how well the following programs and sub-programs address and achieve the core mission. Number two, how much interest is there in supporting this program area? Number three, incentive to fund. To what extent do you believe the activity motivates funders and donors to contribute resources to the organization? On this next slide, we have more sample questions. So does the program provide a service that is not readily available or affordable elsewhere in the community? Does the program currently reach the maximum number of participants? And to what extent does the activity lead participants to other programs within the organization? We can average the ratings for all of the questions, and that will give us one of two data points that we need to visualize this mission money impact of each of the programs. This exercise also has a dual effect of getting new and old board members up to speed on the ins and outs of the organization and its programs. First, before we get into the numbers, I just want to acclimate all of you to the spreadsheet on this slide. So here we see laid out in this model, which reflects HHY's lines of businesses in the columns on the program side of the spreadsheet. On the capacity side over here, Jordan segregated development from general operations as we discussed earlier. Now, if you own a facility, you may want to create a column labeled facility. And some of you may want to take a closer look at technology. It's up to you how detailed you want to get. So Jordan's going to use her 2018 current forecast to fill out the tool. And she'll put the revenue in at the top, and she'll put the expenses here at the bottom. So this slide shows the tool after she entered in all those numbers. So let's continue with the architecture. So on the left side of the spreadsheet, you can see all of her programs. So we've got on-site services, mentorship, job, counseling and readiness, and partner services. Not shown here, but in a separate tab, are the sub-programs for 2 of the 4 core program areas. The revenue and expense here are the direct activities associated with the program areas. So if a program were to go away, the associate revenue and expense would go away as well. So for example, if you have a major funder that is discontinuing funding, say in the mentorship program, and you decided that you could no longer continue the program, the salaries and other direct expenses could no longer get paid. On the right, we have capacity. You may think of this as management, general, and administrative lines of business. The revenue and expenses here in capacity are the indirect activities associated with what it takes to just open the doors, turn on the lights, before you produce one unit of service or programming. You can also think of it as revenue and expenses that will not leave your organization if programs change, grow, or discontinue. So for example, the executive director's salary, even if the executive director wears many programmatic hats, will not go away if one of the program alters or goes away. So let's talk about that last point in more detail, salaries. By focusing on salaries, we can discuss how some of the numbers get into their particular cells. So that last point, the executive director. Jordan wears many hats, as many as you do. She is, of course, involved with all programming, but in particular with on-site services, as this is where it all got started. She also spends at least 30% of her time raising funds for the organization. So where does she put her salary and benefits? According to the direct methodology, Jordan's salary is captured in general operations. So first off, we try not to allocate in this model. So we have to find a home for her, just one home, just one cell. We really can't put her in any one of the programs because if any of them go away, we're not going to reduce her salary if that happens. We could split her between development and general operations, but again, we want to get a clear understanding of the economics. And if the business model of the organization changed where they were far less reliant on development activities, would we reduce her salary? No. So in general operations, she goes. Now, I do want to highlight an exception. On this slide, in mentorship, we have one program manager who manages both the junior high and the high school mentorship programs and manages them both equally. As you can see, his salary is split between the 2 programs. In arriving at this allocation, he knows that if one of the programs goes away, for instance, if they lose funding for the junior high program, his salary would be reduced by half, and he now becomes a part-time employee. This is the opposite case of the executive director. No matter what happens to any of the programs, her salary will most likely remain intact. The same would be true of rent expense. If we, or if they operated all programs out of one building, rent would go into general operations. The idea being that just because you lost one program, most likely you would not be able to reduce your rent. Of course, it depends on the specific situation, but that is the rationale that we use to fill in the spreadsheet. All right. As we discussed earlier, Jordan had received a bit of bad news from 2 of her funders. One grant was expected to be reduced by $50,000 and the other by $10,000, making a gap in her budget of nearly $15,000. After inputting the financial data into the model, Jordan was left with the following data. So let's start by taking a look at the big picture. By separating out the direct and indirect revenue and expenses, HHY was left with a direct program deficit of $57,000 and an indirect capacity surplus of $42,000, ultimately totaling to a projected deficit of $15,000, give or take. Jordan was left with some challenging questions to answer. Which activities and programs are core to the mission? Are they positive financial contributors to the enterprise or negative? What are some of the non-negotiables in my budget? Meaning, I really don't feel comfortable with making cuts to these certain items at this point in time. So using this view of the data, Jordan called a meeting with her senior staff and a couple of board members to discuss the results to help her get to the bottom of some of these questions. Diving a bit deeper into the individual program areas, they saw the following. First, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, on-site services is forecasted to be a deficit-producing program, generating $36,000 deficit. They had a hunch that it typically lost money, so the deficit really wasn't a big surprise. Mentorship looks as if it will produce a profit of about $63,000. This is driven by the fees that they receive from the school system in addition to foundation funding. Job counseling and readiness also produce a small surplus, and partner services produces a small deficit of $16,000. So Jordan was quick to remind the board that this presentation of the numbers doesn't mean that these are ineffective programs or that they are being run poorly, but it is worth exploring further to see if they can get to the root cause of the deficit. On the capacity side, it produces a surplus, primarily the result of a handful of small to medium-sized foundations that provide general operating support. The organizational $15,000 deficit is relatively small, and some may even consider this break-even results, and not necessarily bad. An organization, particularly during a recession, may actually choose to break even or endure a small deficit rather than making cuts to staff or programs. That's why it's important that the program economics methodology be considered in the context of both internal areas of risk and outside political and an economic environment. However, in the case of HHY's leadership, they have prioritized generating surpluses that can be used to rebuild its unrestricted net asset base. HHY will not meet its long-term balance sheet goals if it continues a practice of breaking even or incurring even the smallest of deficits. So the next few slides, we're going to dig into some of the programs and look at their subprograms. In terms of subprograms, some organizations will have them, others will not. It really depends on what's meaningful for you. One best practice is to start broad and then drill down into subprograms if you need to. In this case, Jordan really wanted to see some further detail. So first, let's look at the subprogram of on-site services. Let's begin on the right-hand side with program management. So what do we see? One grant provides the funding for the entire program, and one program manager runs all of the programs. So here's the grant, and here's the manager. My first question would be, are there any opportunities available for additional fundraising, especially since the program has been around for a long time? Or is this considered a legacy program that may have run its course? What's the history? What funding did it get in the past? Was it more than the current amount? And if so, why have those funders moved on? Now let's move on to the subprograms. They have food, recreation, and clothing that you can see at the top. While all programs appear to have high mission alignment, the food program was the first of all services to be offered and continues to be one of the organization's core programs despite producing a $30,000 deficit. Management and board agree that this mission-critical program needs to stay. What about the other two programs? Both produce small deficits with no revenue attached. So how necessary are they to the overall program? Is there a way to provide the programming without the expense? In this case, the expense is program supplies. Also, in the case of the clothing sub-program, the other expense is donated clothing. So who sorts the clothing? Staff, volunteers? And how much time does that take? Could this be an activity for the teams to take on? After discussing various ideas, but not really settling on anything yet, the team was ready to move on. Next, they discussed the mentorship program. Despite this group of programming generating a healthy surplus, Jordan wanted to understand if there were any opportunities to grow or change the mentor program, specifically the high school program, as it's producing a small surplus. From a mission perspective, mentorship is important to the organization and provides great impact for both mentors and also the mentees. Let's again start with the program management column. We find a $120,000 restricted grant that has to be used in mentorship, but the organization has some flexibility as to how they can spend those dollars. In addition, they have a program manager who oversees all of the mentorship programs. So both the revenue and the program director will go into this column. Jordan facilitated the conversation and asked the group for suggestions and ideas. One staff member suggested introducing fees to charge the mentors to help increase revenue. However, this business model was run on paying volunteers small stipends, so charging fees would be a complete reversal. And right here, we've got volunteer incentives for both programs. On the expense side, the organization could reduce staff costs as this expense is the primary driver of the program. However, given how lean the organization already was, Jordan did not feel comfortable with operating the mentorship program with so few staff. Also, all right, so let's go into the model. And let me escape out of here. All right, so I've got the model up on the screen. And leadership really did want to make some decisions about the mentorship program as a result of the priority to generate surpluses and also its aversion to cutting staff. So they decided that they would redesign the volunteer incentive program and provide stipends according to a sliding scale instead of providing a flat stipend per student mentor. So Jordan reduced this cost in each program by half from $1,600 to $800. And so we'll do that right here. In addition, they had a discussion on venue selection and decided to look into less expensive options. One board member thought that they could move the venues closer to the schools and save about $5,000. If the venues were closer to the schools, they also thought that they could cut the travel expenses in half. So Jordan reduced venue expense from $8,500 to $6,000. And down here, saving on travel costs, they went from $1,000 to $500. So in the end, they were able to increase the surplus by another $7,000. So we see here, we've got $70,000 surplus, and previously it was $63,000. All right, let's go back. All right. So how about development? HHY has a 4th of July fundraiser, teen poetry slam, and also a column for general development. Let's start with general development. It's the place to capture all of the unrestricted grants and donations that may come into the organization. While this is a hefty surplus, don't forget that this surplus is necessary to cover all the other program and administrative deficits. As mentioned before, the Teen Poetry Slam has been very successful in garnering corporate sponsors and thus has a nice surplus. But what surprised the team was the 4th of July fundraiser. While it's less core to the mission, it has become more important over the years because it had provided good visibility for the organization and the community. Leadership had assumed that it was also a good fundraising opportunity, which is why they were surprised to see that this event actually produced a deficit. So again, Jordan asked, should they not go forward with this 4th of July fundraiser in the future and they could save, $725, or should they look to improve its outcome? Did it still have potential as a fundraiser? So leadership thought it was worthwhile to discuss, and so let's go into the model, back into the model, and we're going to go over to the developments tab. So they discussed a variety of ways to how they could fund this event, and they landed on a strategy to pursue a corporate sponsor for the event at $10,000. In addition, the board committed to increase its participation and make a more deliberate effort to increase donations from friends and family. They were confident that they could raise at least $3,000 that would not have otherwise come into the organization. So Jordan changed this $20,000 to $33,000, or an increase of $13,000, the $10,000 and the $3,000. Now, let me just say one thing. Before doing this program economic analysis, a few members of the group had noticed that the organization had a $5,000 consultant contract in addition to a large $120,000 contract for job training. They had originally thought that the $5,000 contract was something that they could get rid of, but it became clear once seeing the forecast in this detailed format that the $5,000 was the fee to pay for the event planner. And you can see on line 76 here, there's the consultant fee of $5,000. So once they decided that they would continue with the event, they knew they had to keep this event planner as well. So while development was an area that generated a surplus, it was still important for Jordan to take a critical look to see if there were any areas for improvement. Well, now we're going to go back in. And all right. After the modifications reflecting the changes made to the subprograms, the organization is now generating an $11,000 surplus, a big improvement from the deficit of $15,000. That $11,000 will begin to build the organization's balance sheet with resources it needs to support their mission. I do want to acknowledge that this process can be tough and often requires having some frank and difficult conversations. It doesn't always work out so neatly, and for HHY, there were still some questions left unanswered. Should they continue with the on-site services? Should they continue with recreation and clothing subprograms? And there are other questions that didn't get raised. For instance, does the organization need a full-time staff to coordinate partner services? Should partner services be continued at this time? Is it core? How core is it to the mission? Can they raise more money to cover that deficit? Also, would more dedicated staff or contractors be helpful in the development department? In the end, the first step to making change often lies in understanding what you're working with and thoughtfully balancing the desire for profitability with mission success. Now, with their $11,000 projected surplus, Jordan did not want to lose sight of full cost or below-the-line budgeting. So let's go back into the model, and we're going to go over to the mentorship program. Now, Jordan believes that she's going to receive a $15,000 grant that's going to be available to purchase a van of a similar amount. Now, this is not only a restricted grant to purchase a capital item, but also the donor is expected to give the money specifically to the mentorship program so that they can take the youth on field trips. So that's why we're in the mentorship tab, and we're going to enter in the numbers here. Here's $15,000 that goes into the space for a capital grant. And then we've got $15,000 for a purchase of a van. And then in addition, Jordan was interested in setting aside $1,000 for either repairs to the van or to set aside in a repair and a replacement reserve. And so we're going to put that $1,000 right here. Now, let's go back over to the overall tab, and you can see that the mentorship, these capital items have flowed through. And so this is, to give you an overall result. But she also wanted to set aside $16,000 to set aside for savings. So you can see here, set aside for savings, $16,000, and that goes into general operations. All right, back to, all right. So when you combine the two parts of this analysis, the numbers from the program economics direct methodology, and also the mission impact survey to inform the mission piece, you can create a graph that looks like this. Notice the 4 quadrants that we talked about earlier, with mission on the horizontal axis and margin on the vertical. The size of the budget, the size of the bubble is equal to the budget size. So the bigger the bubble, the bigger the budget. As you move up and down the chart, you can get a sense for profitability and across here for mission alignment. So here are a few observations that we can make. The first is that all programs have positive mission alignment, although some of the programs are more mission aligned than others. You can see mentorship and also on-site. Second, 2 of the programs produce clear surpluses, the other 2 produce deficits. There are some interesting conversations that you could have based on the information, even without a detailed understanding of the organization. So for instance, is the surplus being thrown off by mentorship enough to cover the deficits of both on-site and partner services? Are there opportunities to scale mentorship, given its link to mission and the ability to generate a surplus? Using this visualization of your organization's budget can help spark deeper conversations about where there are areas for improvement or change. And with that, I've got, just so you all know, I've got pretty much 2 more slides of content, but I thought I'd break for questions. Rashi.
Hey, Alice. Yes, we had some good questions that came in. One question is a question on the indirect expenses. In the that you covered in the sheet, are all the indirect expenses housed in the general operating column, even though indirect expenses such as finance team, tech team, ops team support each program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've got the spreadsheet up. You can see it here. I'm going to collapse these 2. The way that Jordan set this up, all the indirect expenses are located either in development or in general ops. But you're right, you could do a column for the finance team, you could do a column for technology, if you want a facility, you could do a column. These all support the program. So instead of capacity, you could call it support areas. They are critical, and I do not, I want to emphasize this. The capacity of the organization or the support area of the organization is critical. And if you think about it, it cradles the programs of the organization. You cannot operate without any of these critical support services. But this analysis is to really get a sense for the direct contribution, or the opposite, the direct deficit, if you will, of any of the programs produced here. So for instance, if the team decided, you know what, on-site services, it's a legacy program, we're not going to do it anymore, we can essentially eliminate this program without affecting any of the personnel or any of the expenses here. The finance team is going to still remain. The facility is still going to remain, technology is still going to remain, but we're just going to be able to take out these direct expenses and also the direct revenue, and we would have savings of $36,000. So it really gives us a quick way of understanding, you know, how can we improve the overall financial performance of the organization. But I don't want to diminish that all this, these expenses in here are critical, but for this purpose, we are not allocating. And next week, we'll get more into allocation. And again, going back to the previous slide, it depends on what question you're trying to answer. All right, Rashi, let's keep going and let me finish up, and then we'll take the further questions if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Okay. So these two slides are really just wrap up. So if you're interested in completing a program economics or direct methodology exercise on your own, here are the 9 steps. And oh, by the way, we went through each one of these 9 steps as we went through the detail of this presentation. So the first one is inquiry. So what question are you trying to answer? Again, if you want to get at that, you know, deficit that you have in your organization, doing program economics this way through a direct methodology will be able to highlight areas for improvement, change, or maybe discontinuing some programs, or on the opposite, scaling up those programs. Then we want to create a program and capacity architecture. So we want to identify programs and areas of capacity, essentially identifying your major programs or your lines of businesses. Then we want to rank and prioritize programs according to mission impact. Next, we want to fill in the model for both expense and revenue, starting by assigning personnel to their associated programs. This is most likely the difficult part because we're really not trained to keep, and what I like to think of is one salary in one cell. You know, that's the default. Find a place, one place for this person. It could be in a particular program. It could be the executive director, which goes into general operations. Try not to allocate. And if you do allocate, you have to be able to answer that question. If I allocate, will I reduce that person's salary if the program is discontinued? All right, next we take a step back. We do some initial high-level observations, identifying what we're seeing. Then we can use the model for strategic conversations with leadership. Having accurate data is part of the battle, but you also need to be able to make some choices and decisions here. Next, we want to assess the model for initial modifications, having some of those more difficult conversations. Then we want to budget for capitalization needs. And lastly, we can complete that mission money matrix and create a bubble chart, if you will, to just see, you know, how everything lines up. Now, let me tell you that a lot of this is iterative, as you can well imagine. You know, you just don't go through 1 through 9, but there's a piece in here that you can go back and forth as you move. So this is the last slide of our webinar, and I just wanted to remind you all of some strategic questions that this kind of analysis is intended to address. So first, what is the revenue and expense variables that we can adjust to reduce an organizational-wide deficit? Which programs may be scaled or contracted? What is the implication on the enterprise bottom line? How might we do business differently so our programs and capacity are supported in the short term and in the long term? And how can we generate a surplus sufficient to cover our organization's future capitalization needs? And so that is the end of the webinar. And Rashi, I just want to turn it back to you for additional questions.
Yes. So I think this question is related to the last question, which is, isn't the use of a facility a direct allocation? That is, if 50% of your facilities are devoted to a program, they are getting that resource rather than another program. So how is that accounted for?
Yeah, so another great question. In this model, let's say we have one building and its headquarters And let's just say, for argument's sake, all of our programs are operated out of this one building. Let's say we get rid of on-site services. It's just no longer working for the organization. It's a legacy program, and we get rid of it. When we get rid of it, and let me go back to the model, you see that on-site services produces a $36,000 deficit. If we had an allocation of the facility, and let's just say, for argument's sake, it was an extra $10,000, we would actually be showing a $46,000 deficit here, but we wouldn't have $46,000 in savings. And that is because we can't change the rent. And I'm going to make the assumption that in this case, we can't change the rent. Just because we're reducing the program, we can't change the rent, and we still have to pay that rent. So we still have $10,000. Now, if we don't have on-site services anymore, we have to make that transfer back to general operations for that extra $10,000. Rather than going through all the transfer, it's super helpful just to see, and this is the big kind of my emphasis here on this type of analysis, is just to see what the impact is on the bottom line. So I know to me, this is very clean. I know if I get rid of this program, I will have $36,000 worth of savings because I don't have to rejigger any allocations. Now, if you do want to do allocations, and I typically do with my clients, I will put in a whole nother area down below and then do some of those allocations. The facility, the executive director, finance, all sorts of things. I can do that below here. But I really, for what I want to do and what I want to accomplish in the beginning is just to see kind of the clean economics, if you will, without any allocations. So I know where the savings are if I decide to tinker with a particular program. And the opposite of that, perhaps mentorship, maybe I should be doubling this, right? What if I find two more, another high school program and another junior high program? It's possible, and find a funder, of course, that supports it. It's possible I might be able to double this and bring an additional $70,000 into the program, right? Again, if facility were allocated in here, let's say again, $10,000, I'd have to reduce this down to $59,000, and I wouldn't get kind of the clear economics that I'm looking for. All right, how about one more question? I know we're coming very close on time, but is there a quick and dirty question that could be asked?
Yes, there is, and exactly that type of question. So the other question was, I know when you re-entered cost per facility, and I think the brainstorm that you did with HHY was moving closer to the school would probably reduce costs, and the question is related to that. Would reallocating closer to schools have additional costs associated with it?
That's absolutely, that probably is the case. But for the purposes of what I wanted to show you today, I just wanted to get into the model and, just show the reduction in cost and how we can do that. But you're absolutely right. There may be some one-time costs that, are allocated with a move that's closer to the high school or to the junior high, but for purposes here, it was just to make it, an example. So with that, let's keep going, Rashi, and I'm going to pass it to you for the last couple of slides.
Great, thank you so much, Alice. So before we close out, I'd just like to let you all know that on our next webinar, that is Untangling the Multiple Views of Cost, we'll be diving into the steps to calculate the comprehensive cost of your programs that Alice reviewed with us today. This session will help you better understand the cost of mission delivery, which you can then use for your fundraising and financial storytelling purposes. This webinar and our other remaining webinars are, there's still time to register for those, and we have plenty of packages that offer 15% discount of multiple webinar sessions. Also, just as a reminder, I will email you the webinar recording, slides, and supplementary materials within 24 hours after today's session is complete. Once you close out of the webinar, you will be prompted to take a feedback survey, and that feedback survey is unique to today's session. So we would really love to hear from you and request you to take that feedback, the survey for us. Finally, I would like to thank our partners that are listed here. They're absolutely critical to the success of this series, and we are really honored to work with each of them. I really hope you all enjoyed our conversation today, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.